It's interesting listening to Mike and a few of the other speakers. There's a lot of factors that are very relevant to the Brahman breed, particularly in live export. And if I can give you one message on you guys today, it is please take this very seriously because there's no other sector in Australia that appreciates the attributes of the Brahman breed more than live export, and I can say that from very first-hand experience. Just by way of my background, I've for those of you who don't know me, just to give a bit of context about my presentation, I've been in the live export sector for 15 years now, and my role in our company is to do the marketing. So I travel to Asia about every 6 to 8 weeks. I'm dealing face to face with the importers, the people that pay the money for the cattle. So I'm quite well experienced, I guess, in what they want. And I often say to people, I don't mind if the customer wants pink elephants with spots on them, but we want to supply what they want. And overwhelmingly in our business, they want high-grade Brahman, good quality cattle. So very important. Before my time with the live export, I came to Queensland as the livestock manager with one of the big agency companies. So I've been to plenty of Brahman weeks and worked with a lot of the big pastoral companies across Northern Australia, where I got my interest in live export and understand the importance of that to the industry. So I want to talk a bit about that today. I'll talk a little bit about QLEA, touch on animal welfare. Perhaps go to the next slide, please. Animal welfare, the cost of compliance and regulation and the importance of that, why there is such a very important need for live export, particularly in Northern Australia and Queensland, and particularly for Brahman cattle. Talk about the key markets just a bit deeper than what Michael did in terms of live export and the economic benefit. And we talked, just hearing interesting Matthew and Mike talking about processing costs. I think that's a real thing that this country is going to have to will be challenged on, and that's very important where that fits in with live export in my view. So QLEA first, who are we? Well, I'm on the executive and have been for a number of years of the Queensland Live Export Association. We're very fortunate to have a very strong president at the moment with Greg Pankhurst. He's really re-energised Queensland because I'm not sure if people are aware, but the sector, 15 years ago there was sort of 15 to 18 active live export companies on sea freight, I'm talking, to do not niche or breeding, but the big heavy lifting in live export. Now I think there's 7 or 8 active. Of those 7 or 8, there's only 4 of us that do about probably 70 to 80% of the volumes nationally. So it's a very, very challenging environment. It's a very, very tough business to be in. There are a massive amount of factors that you can't control that impact the trade. Currencies, political decisions, all sorts of factors that you just can't manage. So managing a successful live export business is really about how well you manage risk. So we're very fortunate to have Queensland. It's very important that the key message gets to you people. I know a lot of you guys breed Brahman bulls, so you're not directly probably exposed to live export yourselves, but many of your customers, the commercial breeders, I think in a lot of ways complacent on the importance of the trade, and what we've found and what you've seen with sheep now, that's devastating what's happened to sheep, and we just got to get ahead of the game in terms of preventing that for cattle. And as I said, there's only about 4 of us really active exporters doing 80% of the volume. The federal government's not going to listen to us, but they listen to farmers. And that's where you guys, in your role as breeders and talking to your customers, the commercial producers, have to take a leadership role in bringing awareness to those people about the importance of the trade. Because we've seen it when the droughts are on, or floods, fires, that the government quick to rush to the producer gets empathy. Us as an industry, really, who cares about 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 companies with a handful of people? It's the producers that need to speak up about this, protecting this very important trade. So that's part of one of the key roles of the Queensland Live Export Association. We lobby the Queensland government and federal government, but Queensland specifically in Queensland, about the importance of the industry. Advocacy of the livestock export and educating the greater community. I know Greg and Peter Watkins were very busy last couple of years in road shows, going all over the state, trying to get producers in to explain the importance of the trade. So we want to encourage the development of best practice, support members and developing, creating opportunity within the industry and sharing information. That's our role, but we can only reach so many producers. We need leaders in the business like yourselves to also support us. And of course we support the national organisations like ALEC and LiveCorp that represent the industry. Yeah, as I say, producers, I'll keep harping on about it, I'm sorry if I jump around a bit, but producers, I'll explain a little bit when I talk about the economics, they share more than half of the benefit of the supply chain, and they've got the most at stake, really, with the live export and its importance. So on animal welfare, Australia do lead the world in animal welfare, and QLEA plays a role in supporting that, but us as exporters do. I just put a note there that cattle exports from Northern Australia have a successful delivery rate of more than 99.9%. We lose very few cattle. I can't remember the last time we lost an animal between Australia and Indonesia. We lose the odd big steer or bull going to Vietnam on a longer voyage, 10 or 11 days, but very few. We would have more losses transporting cattle from Cloncurry to Darwin or on road transport within Australia than we do on the live export vessel. It's a big misdemeanour, the lack of understanding. The mortality rate's extremely good. And put the note there, without Australia there would be no progress. So I often talk about Vietnam. We were one of the first exporters to go to Vietnam 10 years ago, and they were literally stunning cattle with sledgehammers. I mean, the local cattle, often they're fairly domesticated, quiet, and they tether them and just use the sledgehammer to stun them. Since Australia started exporting cattle to Vietnam and to comply by OAE standards and under the Export Supply Chain Assurance System, we've had to train those importers to kill cattle humanely. So we supplied restraint boxes, unloading ramps, stunners, penetrative stunners. And now the ironic thing, and the thing that is lost on the animal activists, is they've learned, they're a very, very ingenious race, the Vietnamese, they've learned now it's far more efficient to slaughter a cattle that way. So not only do Australian cattle get slaughtered that way, all the local Vietnamese and Lao, Cambodian, Thai cattle are also slaughtered. So by being involved, Australia's made a positive outcome on not only the lives of Australian cattle, but all cattle. So, it's a really important point. I think Australia's involvement in these supply chains develops and improves the animal welfare of all animals. And if the activists were serious about animal welfare, they'd see that as a positive. So it's important people know that. The Australian ASIL, Australian Standards of Live Export, and the SCAS, Exporter Supply Chain Assurance System, are a big task and very important, because we have to be A grade at that to defend the industry and the merits of the industry. And as mentioned here, these extend from producers' property, and in that there's documentation, which is probably not relevant to you guys, but a lot of commercial producers, once again, are too laxed about that. We have every document audited on every consignment we do, and if there is a vendor declaration that doesn't have a date on it or doesn't have a signature on it, we can lose our ability to operate. We can get penalised because of that. So documentation is incredibly important. Obviously, time in the quarantine, and we have to manage the lives of those cattle from the time we take ownership. So when they're delivered to the quarantine, we're responsible for them, and we have to report their status right up until the time they're slaughtered. So we got to report the movement into the quarantine, onto the vessel, off the vessel into the feedlot or depot within Southeast Asia, and then when the animal's transported from that feedlot, whether it be Indonesia, Vietnam or the Philippines, to the abattoir and the time of death, we have to report that fully on a weekly basis to the Australian government. So it's quite onerous, but it's a very important part of the trade. And the cost of operating a business, because of that animal welfare, our costs include, just to have an export licence now is just under $50,000. The compliance costs us about $73 to $75 a head. For a business like ours, just compliance and regulation costs us about $500,000 a year. And of course levies we pay, which are part of the industry. once again, a business like ours that exports somewhere around 130 to 150,000 cattle, the levies we pay are in the order of 500 to 600,000 a year. And if we sometimes buy cattle and background them to have them over the wet season, we're paying double levies. We pay the export levy as well as the transactional levy. Okay, why is there a need for live export? Well, I think we know the story there. Well, maybe a lot of you don't, but we're a Western society, but we couldn't be further geographically based east. So Southeast Asia is incredibly important. Overwhelmingly, the customers there still want fresh meat. And I've been hearing talk in the industry for a long time, and perhaps there is a trend towards more box meat and refrigerated meat, but I haven't seen a massive change in the 15 years I've been involved. Still very important in all those Southeast Asian countries. They shop for their meat, and not only meat, all their produce, fruit and vegetables. Every day they like to buy fresh meat. That's just culturally important for them. And in Indonesia there's religious reasons why they don't want meat to have gone through rigor mortis. They like the cattle slaughtered the evening before, during the night, and then they consume it the next day. So that's important, despite, as a Western society, what we think that they should have or want. It's irrelevant. The customer is always right, and that applies with live exports. So I'll talk more about why that's important for particularly Northern Australia. Of course, Australian cattle are very well adapted, particularly Brahman cattle, to the climatic conditions in Southeast Asia. But I've seen Brahman cattle in northern China in the winter, and they adapt to that environment as well as the humidity and extremes of Southeast Asian environments. So it's very, very important. I'll just talk a little bit about the markets. Michael made mention of the numbers, and interested the question from David about where he sees numbers going forward. You see, that's just the last, going back to 2019, we saw that was the last fairly serious dry year, and I've heard a lot about what everyone thinks the market will do, and of course it's a supply and demand driven market, like every other market in the world. But these markets in Southeast Asia, we're dealing with developing countries, and they are very price sensitive, whether we like it or not. But the biggest thing that affects the cattle market, from my experience in Australia, is the climate, and when it's dry. So the herd's at a fairly high level now, and we've had 3 pretty good wet seasons. Really, what happens next year is going to be very dependent on what happens this forthcoming monsoon. But if you see back in 2019, I think 670,000 cattle went to Indonesia. That was the year about 1.2 million. Indonesia has taken close to 800,000 cattle, and Indonesia is a country of 260 or 70 million people. Their GDP is increasing and they're growing, so there's no reason why that shouldn't be a very strong market for Australia going forward. I'll talk about in a moment about Indian buffalo beef, because that has had an impact and is going to have an impact going forward. And Vietnam is a fairly new market to Australia. It did take 300,000 cattle there in 2020. I estimate this year it'll probably end up around 120 or 30. And Indonesia this year probably end up around 450,000 odd. And the Philippines used to be Australia's biggest live export market. Buffalo beef ruined that. And but interestingly, we're seeing a little bit more interest out of that country now, and it's developing, its economy is developing too, and as it gets stronger and their economy gets stronger and their buying power increases, hopefully they can buy more Australian cattle. I just want to touch on competing protein, because, as I mentioned, supply and demand and their price-sensitive markets. What happened, and this was totally, once again, out of anyone's control, when our market went really high 3 or 4 years ago, it just got too expensive. A lot of the importers lost a lot of money. We saw some of the biggest importers in Indonesia disappear, just went bankrupt and gone. So there's less importers there now. And as a result of that, Indian buffalo beef was allowed to come to Indonesia. Many people think that was the source of the foot and mouth disease, and it probably was. But for them, it wasn't a question of choice. It was a question of actually having protein to eat, because Australian cattle just became prohibitively expensive through no fault of anyone's. It was just supply and demand, the rebuilding of the herd. But it's well and truly entrenched now. It's used in the staple food production of bakso bull, which is Indonesia, where most of the beef goes. And some commentators and some of the industry players over there are saying it's probably replaced the equivalent of about 200 to 250,000 live cattle, the buffalo beef. So it's something we have to be aware of, and it's something that concerns me, because whilst we're positive about the market, it's still very price sensitive, and if we get a really continued build up of numbers in Australia and then a serious drought, I do have concerns about the capacity of the market to absorb the number of cattle that could become available in a short period of time. We even saw in 2019, I distinctly remember cows, light small frame Brahman cows right up in the Gulf, being really no commercial value at that time because it wasn't worth putting them on a truck to send them anywhere. So it's something that we have to be aware of. We can't do anything about it, it's happened, but it is a factor. Let's talk about the direct economic benefits of the live export trade, and these are some extracts from a report that was done by one of the big four accountancy firms. That's why we're referencing 2021, that's when it was done, and that was a pretty low year for volumes. But in 2021, the live export trade directly and indirectly contributed up to 1.4 billion to the Australian economy, 302 million of that directly in Queensland. Northern Australia provides 74% of the 1 billion farm gate value live cattle trade. And as I mentioned before, greater than 50 cents in the dollar in the supply chain rests with the producer. So if live exports stop tomorrow, over the next 20 years, the industry would lose about 8.1 billion in value. Next one, please. As we know, the trade does provide a critical alternative to the domestic abattoir trade, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, my personal view on that in a moment. Live exports certainly supports Australia's natural competitive advantage, and that's another thing that's lost on a lot of people, particularly when you look right up if you drew a line, so let's say from Mount Isa to Broome, everything north of there, it's good country for breeding cattle, as we know, but it's not the greatest country for fattening cattle. You think about the supply chain from Darwin to Jakarta, 4.5 days on a vessel. And when I say Darwin, we bring a lot of cattle from about Richmond or Hughenden, not Hughenden, sorry, Julia Creek, Richmond, heading west. It's more economical to bring those cattle and ship them out of Darwin than it is out of Townsville because of the sea freight differential. It's 3 days less voyage. So a hell of a lot of cattle, Queensland cattle, are shipped out of Darwin, probably half of ours this year. So that country in Northern Australia is very good for breeding cattle, but not so good for fattening. What in Indonesia, more so than Vietnam, is good at is fattening the cattle through lower labour cost, lower feed commodities. They can, and that's the real value proposition of the trade. They can take a 320 or 30 kilo steer or heifer, and they can grow it to 550 kilos, and in doing that, they can reduce the cost per kilo by 50 to 70 Australian cents a kilo. So that is the value proposition, and that's why it's so complementary to Australia and so important. So it allows us to tap into the value adding, as I've mentioned. Live export transacts, so around roughly 10%, it depends from year to year, but approximately 10% of all cattle sold in Australia. So all producers benefit, because if the trade stopped and all those cattle came back into the domestic supply chain, obviously it creates an oversupply of cattle. So even if you're growing pretty Angus steers in Tasmania, indirectly you benefit from the live export trade. There is no doubt about that. Once again, it's a fairly flexible market. It's a very wide spec, and I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. But we talk about slaughter cattle. You guys know more than I, but you sell cattle on a weight and grade basis. You've got lots and lots of parameters to meet. We're taking, at the moment, our company takes 1 to 2 ships, 4,000 to 5,000, 6,000 slaughter steers out of Townsville every month. And so long as they're about 530 or 40 kilos through to 750, we don't worry about the dentition, the meat colour, the fat colour, as long as the breed's right. And for you guys, importantly, most of the customers want high grade Brahman cattle. It's a wonderful competing factor in the marketplace. Very, very important. And of course the trade creates a lot of jobs. There's 6,000 full-time equivalent jobs directly. 82% of this employment is regional areas across Australia, impacting trucking companies, ports, feed companies, depots, agents. stevedores and vets. I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about this. 8 ports in Northern Australia account for 83%. So the real heavy impact of live export is in Northern Australia. We talked about cost of processing before. I don't think you can deny, this is I'm getting on a little bit of a personal view here, but I've been in the industry for a long, long time. I don't want to get distracted, but I think this is a critical point. You can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I'm right in saying this. Since the car manufacturing industry in Australia was shut down, and I would say because we got too expensive in our labour cost, probably mainly due to trade unions, and I might get a little bit controversial here, but that's my view, that ceased. I think the biggest employer of manufacturing workers in Australia now is in the meat processing sector. And Mike, you might correct me, but I believe Australia is the most expensive country in the world to process an animal. So, and getting more expensive. You know what's happening in the labour market with the government, with their industrial relations policy. The abattoirs are big users of power, water. So the cost per kilo to produce a kilo of meat in Australia, we're uncompetitive in the world. So Michael made reference to the feedlot sector growing. I think, fast forward 20 years, will be very similar to the US model. We have to be, and the reason is because the Australian meat processors have to sell to the most discerning markets. The most discerning markets want grain-fed meat because it meets the expectation that they want in terms of, you know, marbling meat colour, fat colour. Japan, South Korea, China's a little different, but I think you'll see more and more cattle go through feedlots. But that will mean that the live export sector becomes even more important in my view. So we're no different really, apart from we're dealing with a live animal, and I stressed before the importance of animal welfare, we take very seriously. So long as we can manage that and the community supports the trade, by default, the supply chain of taking an animal, just like we take iron ore or coal, to a close Asian nation to value add it, I think the economics of that will become more in the favour of live export because of the cost of process in Australia. That's my belief. We're, as I say, very, very close, and they can grow the animal, value add it and process it in Asia much, much more cheaply. A lot like we sell our iron ore and we buy the steel back. We sell our oil and buy the petrol back. I'm not saying we'll get to that stage, but I think you'll see that become a bigger issue and a bigger influence over the industry in the next 10 years. And I think that bodes well, and what encourages us by running a live export company is that those economic factors are well and truly on our side. So the role of the Brahman, and it's incredibly important. I just, as I say, I'm dealing with the customers, the importers, the people that pay the money for the product, and overwhelmingly they want high quality, high grade Brahman cattle. It's been a frustration to us. I think one of the biggest issues, or biggest detriments of the Brahman breed was when the trade was suspended back in 2011. It pushed a lot of the commercial breeders to want to put crossbred or put a cross in to in their terms, soften their cattle up so that they had the option to come south if something ever happened to live export. And what's that meant? That has meant to us as a buyer of cattle is there's fewer and fewer places that have pure high-grade Brahman cattle that we want. But I do sense just recently that trend is changing. Talking to a few of the big producers we buy from, that have put centre poles. This is not breed. I'm not breed bias at all. Like I said, if the customer wants elephants with pink spots, we'll try and supply them. But I've seen a trend now. They're going back to Brahman cattle. Which I think is really positive for you guys, because if you analyse it over a 10-year period, the live export market has been the best market for producers, you know, of generic cattle in Australia, generic commercial cattle. I can remember we were paying $3.50 for a 330 kilo Brahman steer in Darwin, and at the same time, you know, an Angus, a pretty Angus or crossbred Bos Taurus steer down in New South Wales or Victoria was making 30 to 40 to 50 cents less. So it's a really, really good market. Like I said, the specs are wide. So I see that the Brahman breed, live export is a big influencer, and I think for you guys, you'll see that the trend back towards Brahman cattle I believe, because that's the market signal, that's what the customers want, and that'll influence people's breeding, what type of bulls they use. And I think a lot of producers, not that I'm an expert on cattle production, but they've realised now, they talk about fertility, they talk about weaning rates, etc., but a lot of producers I've heard say once they learn to manage their nutrition of their cows better, that has a big impact on their fertility, and rather than chasing crossbred cattle potentially. Anyway, if I can leave you with one message, the existence of the live export trade is an essential component of the Australian and the Queensland particularly and Australian beef industry. As producers and stakeholders, really you guys need to get motivated. You need to talk to your customers, the commercial breeders. Don't think that what happened to sheep might not happen to cattle. You have to be on the front foot and protect the industry, because there's only a handful of us in it. I've got my livelihood in it, but you guys as cattle producers have far more at stake. So yeah, if there's one message, it is please get involved. QLEA, we're always looking for more members, and we always rely on the broader community to spread the word about protecting the industry. It is a good industry, it's a very important industry, and it's incredibly important for the Brahman breed. But that's about it I had to say. If there's any questions, I'm more than happy to answer or talk to anyone.
Yeah, Tony, just one from me to start with. Look, we've seen cattle prices, store prices especially, in the last 2 or 3 weeks increase 10 to 15% to well over $3. $3 seemed to be a bit of the price point with live export. Like, how much room do you think there is for growth for you blokes to stay competitive with what the feedlots are going to be paying in central Queensland and the north?
You're talking for small cattle, Matt, or sort of?
Yeah, store Brahman steers, for an example.
Well, they're price-sensitive markets. I mean, a lot gets back to other factors like the currency, of course. We sell in US dollars, and the cost of sea freight, which has increased about 20% this year. But overwhelmingly, I think the market can survive above $3 in the long term, but right at the moment it's still tough. Those countries are still getting over COVID, if you can believe it. They say until back till 220. They don't expect to get back to pre-COVID economic prosperity until at least 2025. So it's still quite tough there at the moment in those industries. But they want, more than anything, they want steady food price. Food security for a lot of those nations is very important. It's something we take for granted, but their governments are very conscious of stability, and that's the frustrating part, because our market's extremely volatile, because it's influenced by the season and other external events. But yeah, I think even at $4 a kilo, they were surviving. But obviously it's sensitive, and if you look at those numbers on that graph, the lower the price, the more volume that goes to Southeast Asia, historically. But yeah, there's still, there's no reason why it can't be at a reasonable level. But at any one time, you're competing. 3 months ago, the cattle were a lot cheaper in Queensland than they were in the Northern Territory. So a lot of the exporters were operating out of Townsville. And what happens, unfortunately, when the market starts to reduce, then it's just a race to the bottom. Everyone's reducing the price in Asia, and that causes the same impact in Australia. It's very difficult to predict, actually.
Yeah, thank you. There was a bit of a pleasant spot there where, as you say, the Angus feed index in Victoria was a fair bit shorter than the
yeah, for sure.
Export index. We didn't have anywhere near as many complaints, did we, Reid, through that year? It was a very pleasant year. Stewie Wallace.
Yeah, Tony, just question on quality. Just for producers selling into the market, obviously we see a flat rate. It might be $2.70 or whatever it is for everything across the board. Have you got any indication from your buyers for a premium for an animal that is going to produce better in their pen, in their beef pens?
Oh, definitely. When I talk to the importers, we look at 3 factors in buying the cattle. And it's amazing how much it determines, like I said before, the the cost of gain is the key. It's not so much the ADG, that's important, but it's the cost. The cost for them and they're very sophisticated in measuring. The cost to put that kilo of weight on, that's the critical part that makes them viable or not. And we look at three things when we're selecting cattle. We look at one, where the country the cattle come from. As if you overlap a phosphorus map of the NT particularly and North Queensland, anywhere where there's better levels of phosphorus, the cattle normally do better. So the country's one, the genetics number two, and the management number three. So cattle that are weaned properly. For us, it's important. We only have the cattle for a very short period of time, and the weight movement is a critical part of our. If we lose 1% of the weight gain while we've got the cattle in our ownership, because we pay the producer when the cattle arrive at the quarantine or wherever the waypoint is negotiated, and we get paid when the cattle are delivered overseas. So that movement in that period of somewhere between 7 to 15 days, we have to manage. That's critical for us. So we look at the country the cattle come from, the way they're managed, and the genetics. They're all important factors, but also the way they're handled. So cattle that are fed lick and even supplementary fed as weaners that adapt to the feed more quickly in the quarantine and on the vessel, that's really important. That's a big predicator on the weight movement while we have them, and of course it also has an influence on the way the cattle perform in the feedlots. So yeah, the Indonesians particularly, who are more sophisticated, they know exactly what cattle perform better for them, and obviously us as buyers, if we say we're going to market cattle from a certain property or a certain brand, they know them by brands. They are willing at times to pay, and we do as buyers, pay more for those cattle that we know have a more predictable outcome and provide a better product for the customer.
So when we see the emails come through from agent or whoever exporter, we don't see that. We only see a flat rate.
Possibly. That's where it needs to be another level. It need to have the relationship, I guess, with either the agent or the exporter about, your cattle and the proven performance, and if they've performed well and the customer's willing to pay more. In Queensland and Vietnam, it's a little different. It's not because there's so many smaller properties. It's hard. We can go into some properties and buy a full ship in the Northern Territory, and then they get that predictability. But it's a bit more difficult in Queensland, when you might have, typically a vessel out of Queensland would have 40 to 50 different vendors. In Darwin, maybe 2 or 3 or 4. So, but there is premiums paid for high performing cattle, is in short. Conversely, there's discounts paid for poor performing cattle. Which is the way it should be.
Stuart Ball.
Tony, just going in a bit deeper on what Stu Wallace is going into, I think a lot of producers out there don't see the net returns and genetic advancement. It's sort of having a bit of an impact in bull selection and their price point of buying bulls. And some larger producers sort of got fed up with supplying steers at the same rate of colours that haven't put any genetic advancement into their cattle and their herds. Without that price point differential, there's not going to be a lot of increase.
I think you often hear producers wanting to know and understand how they get a premium, and I do understand and respect that. But I think the difference is, when it gets tough, the producers with the superior genetics, they'll be able to move their cattle. The blokes that haven't put the effort and time into their cattle, they're going to be in a big, a lot of trouble. So, as I mentioned, there is, premiums paid for well-performing cattle, and there's no doubt about that now. But I think it's the situation to avoid is when we get a cracking, ripping drought again, there'll be some producers that haven't put the time and effort into their livestock. They're going to find it hard to move them. But there is definitely premium paid for cattle that are consistently good performers. And overwhelmingly for Southeast Asia, they want high-grade Brahman cattle.
Could you just tell us what you feel the future is with the buffalo beef in Indonesia, and also what does it look like with other countries, like Brazil, for instance, supplying this market?
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about. Well, the first part, good question. Buffalo beef's a little bit unknown in Indonesia. Greg might have a stronger view than me about it, but it's certainly a factor now. But it seems to have found a level where it's got an existence as blended with fresh meat or frozen box beef from Australia, because it's not only has buffalo beef come into the market, but there's a lot more volumes of frozen meat from Australia and New Zealand and Brazil gone into the market now. I think there's a place for both products. It just concerns me a little that I'm hoping the market overall will grow. Like I said, it's 270 or 80 million people. They only eat 2.2 kilos per 8 EG of meat. We're on 37 or 8 kilos. They're 2.2. So as their GDP, if you look at every developing nation across the world, as GDP increases, so does beef consumption, because it's seen as a healthy product. So we're hoping that the overall Indonesian market will grow to a level that still supports Australia, notwithstanding the fact that they've got Indian buffalo beef. Brazil, I think, look, it's 30 plus days. To make it viable, a ship's got to hold 25,000 cattle. It's very doubtful, but I'm not saying it won't happen. One went from Brazil to Vietnam, but it was a disaster financially. So I don't think it'll happen anytime soon. But yeah, I think it's an incredibly important market for Australia and live cattle, and natural supply and demand will dictate the price, and it'll always be sensitive to price. But we feel confident that there's a strong future for Australian cattle in those markets.
Tony, changing the subject away from Asia, at the moment there's a bit of an opportunity to actually, with record high feeder prices in the US.
Yeah.
Do you actually think they'll actually happen? Like, do you see boatloads of feeder steers going to the US?
Well, I don't think it's beyond the realms. I understand the government is working on the protocol, government to government, the health protocol, because there's not one in place at the moment. But came back from visiting my daughter actually in Canada. She works on a cattle ranch in British Columbia, and I was talking to them on the ranch there. The prices they're getting, they're selling, they call it 1,000-pound steers to cargo and getting phenomenal prices. And they're saying there and in North America that the population, as Michael said, is heading down. So yeah, I'm not saying it's impossible for sure. And I believe there's discussion going on government to government about agreeing the health protocol. So it'd be another good market, because it's a market obviously that can afford to pay for good quality cattle.
How many days on a ship?
I'm not sure how many to be. I presume it's something like Brazil to Asia, 30 odd days. Yeah, there's vessels capable of doing that. No problem. Big vessels.
It's interesting though, you can go back to 3 or 4 of Brahman News as a Brahman House to the 1960s, and we've been worried about Brazil since then, and it comes up every 3 or 4 years, and it just never seems to quite get there. I mean, they've got a huge population that consumes their own product. Well, thanks Tony, that was absolutely fantastic. No more questions. We will break for a short smoko after this, so if anybody's got any more questions. Thanks Tony. We fully understand a strong live export industry is a strong cattle industry, is a strong Brahman industry, so thanks very much. Please,
I can't stress enough, when you're talking to the people you sell your bulls to, please talk about live export and its importance. It's really, we're relying on the producers to support us here. Don't let what happened to sheep happen to cattle.
Is there still some room for us to help lobby?
Oh, totally.
The sheep group? I think that's
the sheep.
Something we all have to take on board. Maybe change of government will help, but I really do think if that gets reversed, then we are in a huge position of safety that nothing can ever happen to the cattle industry. If it gets banned, we may not be next, but someone's going to have a go.
No, they're not going to relent, the animal welfare groups. They're not going to relent, and it's political. Whether we like it or not, it's political. It's not factual. So, as I said, governments will listen to producers, but you've got to get it proactive. Producers have to be proactive in putting it up as front and centre.
Thank you.
Righto.